Hello everyone, today we talk about the Europeans in the Holy Land during the Crusades, a topic that we already addressed here and there. We actually made a lot of videos about the Crusades. Last year, randomly not so much, so there are renewed or brand new perspectives we can bring on the table. And definitely there is always a lot more to say, right, to the infinite, about one of the single most important chapters in Western history, as well as one of also the most controversial, not for the usual reasons for which Crusades are discussed today, which are entirely modernistic and secularistic. It doesn't matter, people are essentially either lovers or haters of the Crusades for reasons that have fundamentally nothing to do with what Crusades were. Including, and I kind of battled for this in the early videos, on the concept that these were fundamentally uniquely some kind of war of religion, as opposed to, I don't know, other wars at the time that were not about religion, which again betrays completely the complete ignorance on the subject and the proper framing context within which the Crusades should be read. That is to say, of course, there were wars of religion if you attach a religious value to them, and especially in the way it was magnified, indeed, by Reformed papacy, and something that is usually not stressed enough, at least historiography does. Again, what pertains to the broader interest in the Crusades doesn't quite take in consideration the internal, in fact, European meaning of the Crusade, which is by far the most important thing to read them, even more than the Crusade per se. You would be surprised that I never got a particular interest in the Crusades per se. I don't know, that's just me, it's subjective. I've come to study them a bit better, also through Schwerpunkt. In fact, as we were saying before, we made really lots of videos, especially about warfare, really, which, is the thing I'm interested in the most, but unavoidably we had to introduce them in this kind of manualistic fashion. And there would be an entire, in fact, perspective to stress, which I hope to do in this video, regarding the clash that existed at the time in Europe between universal powers and how the Crusades and the monastic military orders were developed in function of both, depending on essentially what side the world and the individuals were taking at that point, because there is this looming perspective on the idea that in the tripartite social order of the Indo-European peoples, fundamentally the military class was the one provided with the faculty of command proper, and that was factually the sacred one. With Christianization, this thing was shifted towards the priestly one, right? It's an important change. And so the investiture controversy that is happening exactly in the moment which Crusades were Crusades, we made videos about this. I mean, they didn't really begin in 1095, 96. They were already going on, and as I was saying before, right, we should determine there what is a crusade, what is a war of religion as well, because as far as war of religions are concerned, there wasn't basically any single army in previous history that hadn't fought because of God, and for God and on behalf of God, right? Nor in the pagan world, in Christian world, unfortunately, there's a despicable anti-clericalistic attitude in the world today, in part because there is a Protestant bias from one side, a post-socialist from another, that mostly also in the fourth estate level melt into this kind of national socialistic and atheistic abortion that I don't know where it's really gonna go. I mean, it's basically the denial of tradition and any possible universal and human value, that wants to see anything that is Christianity as essentially some sort of, and ironically enough, in ways that as you understand, the struggle between the tradition and this gradual secularization and modernization does belong to Christianity as well. These people don't see it mostly. They think that I've met actual people, living beings, that had the courage of saying something like, it's easier to kill in name of Christ than in name of Woden. I mean, these people should be sent, forced to mandatory education. Doesn't matter their age, in a actually work in primary school in first world country before they could even be provided with the faculty of voting. Because frankly, somebody who stresses this makes you understand that there is no tradition, right? That some of them buy into racialism and other things, and nationalism and neo-paganism, basically have not even a remote glimpse of an idea of what tradition actually was. I mean, if they had, I mean, by believing that somewhat there was a sort of secular world before monotheism, that means that you don't understand anything about any history of any kind, like nor religious, military, nothing. Your pagan ancestors, whatever you try to hype yourself, to compensate for your individual inferiority, would have exterminated you for the ideas that you own, right? Because those religions, and Christianity was all one of them, were based exclusively on a military principle. Like, there was no other ideology but war in the entire history of mankind at the core of any universal human value whatsoever, in every single people, religion, everywhere in the world, right? Just an imbecile that, of course, is the perfect example of, the masses unlocked by, just by a mechanistic process that have no education whatsoever can fabricate in their deficient minds to presume something so frankly disgusting, like that. What came from before Christianity was not about war, first of all, in the absolute essence, and that this, by the way, would have been allegedly a negative thing. And that Christianity, by the way, didn't own basically the same idea, and that at that point you have to make, to confrontate with your inner self and ask yourself whether, there isn't something seriously wrong with your mere existence. Because it's a real problem. Like, you can't escape as a human being. Great part of the malaise that derives from our world today is exactly about this. I mean, we ask these questions. Oh my God, how do we fix the world now? Well, we don't have values anymore. Thanks to my eyes, you destroyed them. You basically eliminated them from anywhere. Those were the values. Use them, right? These entire military principles were based in fact on clarity, reason, something that doesn't exist anymore, something that your ancestors would have discriminated and used slaves and serfs just because they were stupid as you, not to understand even, simple responsibility deriving from, like, any free human being to know what's the connection between politics and the use of violence. But again, this doesn't exist, right? We wrote oceanic works on this. Libraries are full of this stuff, and people live in a complete and blissful ignorance about any form of culture for coming up with this buffonade, frankly, because I don't consider a person more than a buffoon and treat them as such when they come up with these ideas. So the Crusades are actually, and in fact they have been portrayed to us like that. One day, Europeans woke up from the Dark Ages and then, began to make war to recover the Holy Land for some kind of religious fanatism. And it backfired, and so it was weird, and somebody says, this was like colonialism. And so, all the other modernistic, secularistic stuff that has basically no idea whatsoever. This is not just missing the entire story of also what Islam was doing. And again, Islam was even in here. Another ridiculous way the Crusades are weaponized is that they're considered in a sense like, the Christian were just the good ones, and the others didn't have values that could be comparable. The Muslims had the same identical values, like they had it in a different perspective, in a different blend of cultural ideas, much which were actually in common with the Western one. I mean, the entire ideology of jihad is motivated by the Indo-European, Persian, in fact, holy war that basically all the Indo-Europeans believed in. And so, aside from the stories and all the intersections between the Christians and the Muslims, we've made a lot of videos about this. there is this sense again that it's just a Western brand, right? And it, for better or for worse, wherever you want to ideologically fanatize the thing. In any case, today we talk about Europeans because at least I, as a European in general, I just know more European history. So this is not to say I couldn't make a video about, I don't know, the Near Easterns in the Crusade. In fact, great part of their history is the same one, but also of other protagonists of the Crusades that came from even other places. And what are the Crusades anyway? Where do we draw the boundary? The Crusades went on up to the 17th century, if you want. Even there to draw a line when what is that we're fighting for today is couldn't be seen as a crusade in some ways. In any case, this is not really the exact video to express these ideas. Just bear in mind that, as always, most things that you've read in history books are, they're not, on school books at least, and taught by, let's skip this other thing, I don't want to be too evil, but let's say, basically, it's not that they are useless, it's that they never meant to have any purpose, but to give you, like, a baby food to digest, just because formally you have to have heard of at least that the Crusades existed, and that's basically what the next generations are at a cultural level in general. In any case, we made videos. If you want to use a bit of background to this, I created an entire Crusades playlist. But there is one, at least among many that are pertinent, that is the, if I'm not wrong, the wasted potential of the Kingdom of Jerusalem. That addresses in part, especially the European settlement. Made videos also about pilgrims, some aspects of the arrière-ban, this kind of auxiliary forces of the Crusader states, about the Turcopoles as well. Today we will mention them, but you know what, I made videos about Christians in the Muslim armies and vice versa. And other aspects about even the pogroms, the hideous wave of anti-Semitism that was unleashed, especially in Central Europe during the time of the Crusades, the many aspects, even concerning with the crude violence of it all, right? That was absolutely normal for the times. I will not digress here even on things that sound like excuses for massacres of innocent civilians, because those are not justified. But let's say, in a sense, there is also a presumption, meaning that, I don't know, that the massacre of Jerusalem is yet another, you see, the Crusaders exterminated not just the Muslims, but also the Jews and the same Christians that live in Jerusalem. Well, you see, when a population actively supports the siege, well, by the laws of the time, which they were doing, by the way, because of course they didn't want the Crusades to take over, well, those kind of it's like, when they exterminated the non-Catars at the siege, when the bishop said, let God recognize their own. At the time, normally, if you supported one side or the other, basically you were massacred in that fashion, at least because you had actively even fought in some cases. You couldn't really distinguish. It was the entire community, and it was seen as, also by the laws of the time, I win, I can do essentially whatever the hell I like with you. We improved a little bit because it turned out it's not a very convenient thing to do, at least in among civilized peoples. But in practice, even there, what is more interesting is the fact that the same Crusaders, instead of lying, saying, no, we didn't kill anybody, like instead somebody's doing to you, at least they said, we did it. And it was bad, right? And a civilization that by the 11th century was able just to document that and describe it and posing the problem is also a hell of a, spiritually developed one, morally developed one in many ways. But this is just to explain also things that we will come back when talking more in depth again about warfare, which we are not doing too much recently because I still am under kind of a atonement regime for needing to re-upload most videos I made already, and I thought that these bases are important to fill those gaps that objectively I had left, in fact, unaddressed, and I realized that by in fact making these videos and picking this topic, saying, well, the fact that I made more than 1,300 videos is still not addressing some of these aspects more in depth is, makes me see that we need to strengthen, to consolidate that plateau of basic, at least in this case, medieval history. And I appreciate your patience. In any case, the process of integration of the Europeans in the new environment after the establishment of the Crusader states was quick. Yet the other myth that is mostly propagandated in these situations is the clash of civilizations. Oh my God! Or the clash of religions and all those things. Actually, there was none of what you think in that sense. There was an obvious coexistence between, as there had been in Seljuk times, in Christian times. If anything, also because owning the Holy Land meant that if you cut, the amount of pilgrims that normally came from all the Abrahamic religious communities, you would have lost a considerable amount of income, right? So there was nothing like modern tolerance in medieval times. That's yet another liberal vulgata that is being spread gratuitously with no reason. It was nothing resembling that. It was just a balance between communities that, yes, they kind of hated each other in a way, or at least they agreed to disagree, and that yet coexisted because they were kind of useful to each other, especially in politics like these that didn't really have a much of a coercive power without the support, like just today, like the support of the decisive moral strength of the communities. And that, so this period of also, in fact, cultural crossing and all these things that were very important indeed in the process, and that we probably overlooked. There has been a sort of defeatism in the West. It's not very useful. In part it's of Marxistic origin because of a sort of self-hatred towards the West, and these people, we just leave them to psychiatrists. Others is just, properly literacy in the sense, after Vietnam there's also this complex, the problem with of the West in crisis. I think that's, just crying baby style, like, and because of the complete unappreciation, in fact, of what this past of ours and our identity fundamentally is. And so we don't have to be scared to tell the story, that is to say, not like a famous French historian said, just pitch fruit is the only thing we got from the Crusades. No, we got really a lot, right? Including the capacity of understanding the other, that can be the enemy as well, and that internationalized dramatically the Western mindset in forms of properly, in fact, in international interaction, diplomacy, what you would call a geopolitics does not exist, but in the language that also you have dreadfully acquired because of journalistic illiteracy. Again, at least you understand what I mean. In any case, that's yet for another video. There was paradoxically more understanding between the Europeans, the Christians, that the Christian Europeans, say better, because of course the locals were also Christian in good part, that had arrived to the Crusades, and those Christian Europeans that and between them and the Christian Europeans that annually in spring landed, prayed on the Holy Sepulchre. They participated to some military action, and then they left again for Europe after some months, right? So there was a neat divide between the Crusaders that stayed and lived among the people, among the locals, and those who just came essentially pro forma by a certain degree, by hoping to win to be saved in the process for their service in the Holy Land for this armed pilgrimage, and then wouldn't actually have much reason to stay. This is a very interesting topic, not just for the obvious cultural implications. I mean, there are stories of, local crusaders welcoming this new ones come straight from Europe and entering in churches where there were also some spaces that were left for Muslims to pray. Muslims would pray towards Mecca, and these newly arrived Europeans would sometimes, we're told by historians, try to turn the Muslims towards the east, where normally Christians prayed for in this idea. In fact, the Holy Land was in the east some way, but they weren't there, so that should have changed in a certain sense. And the story goes that, of course, the hot-headed that didn't really understand much were these newcomers, and the local crusade and the Muslim guy was there said, you gotta understand them because they just arrived from it, they don't know much, right? So there would be an enormous reflection to make on this aspect, and also, as we can't do, but we can somewhat draw a sketch of what even just attitudinally and culturally and by background, like an average 11th or 12th century crusade would look like, right? What ideas, what kind of values and motivations. This is an enormous task, but the primitiveness and the brutality just of these men, it was obvious. These were brought to participate in these expeditions very often just because they didn't have many other options, right? Many other expectations already of profit. But there is a greater idea. I mean, this specific aspect is connected naturally also to two gains that, yes, are moral and material alike, and that we tend not to understand immediately because we are too much habituated to kind of a steady income of some sort. For this man, sometimes leaving for the crusade was the only way of having hopes of some sort of fortune or promotion that didn't have to be readily at hand or evident or kind of even secure, but they may have been, for in fact the economic mindset at that time, more profitable than other activities. And we made recently a video about the pieces and truces of God, and how this movement also was helped definitely to channel the this military resources of the West in the Crusades in a more orderly and disciplined fashion, at least to release this violence against an external enemy rather than disruptively in the within. But it's also more. It's also what you could gain from this armed pilgrimage. Of course, for afterlife, but also in the process with some achievements that in Europe were not becoming, let's say, even traditionally accepted anymore. And in part, this of course has to do, in fact, with the pacification, with the armament of the populace operated by the incipient feudal monarchies, and so this lesser space for just men who had been living mostly as brigands, to tell it all, could allow them to persist in that lifestyle. And so the crusade seemed like a possibility. After all, there was the chance of creating a new lordship there. And another problem that it's important to stress here is, in fact, the manpower shortage. I mean, the Crusades were like the first one was an important thing, was participated, etc. But if we look at the numbers, of course, it was, just an army. Right? What was extraordinary of it was the cohesion for a target was so far, and especially the organization and the logistics of it, because how the Christians took Jerusalem was objectively nothing short of a miracle. It was seen like that. it was a true extraordinary achievement. The First Crusade success was never replicated, but it was enormous. It justified, I would say, the entire crusading epopee, and it was definitely what cemented the mythology of it and the ideology of it, and even the nostalgia of it. Because there were true values and ideals that had stood behind it, aside from this lesser ones, and we will see in part what they were about now. The problem, though, is that when the accomplishment was achieved, a few people would stay. And so the Crusader states had a chronic manpower shortage that people said, no, that's because the crusade was bad. Or because, there were no resources. These places were just too different from Europe to be governed effectively. Europeans were too stubborn. They wanted to impose their own feudalism on lands that traditionally hadn't had them, and they couldn't make them really work. This is, in my opinion, a great misassessment of what actually happened. Because, in my opinion, like, most people were just not interested in living there in the first place, at least the ones coming from Europe. It was not a problem of the local populations, it was a problem, yes, of the rulers, but in their lack of commitment, not really in their, in the way they ran the system, really. Also, their primitive times, they're scarcely documented, really. The crusade, let's say, the full season of it, like, was just 1 century, not even, right before Jerusalem fell again. And so the rest has been just saving the relics of the Kingdom of Jerusalem and a few other Crusader states, but they were something importantly different already in fact, in a world that had changed dramatically and that had brought, let's say, on the fore, something that went even beyond the Near East per se. It was part, in fact, of a much greater project. This much greater project, in a sense, was owned by the great rulers. It's a bit like, I don't know, the Holy Roman Imperial ideal of centralizing again from Rome, governing the Mediterranean. The German nobility didn't really buy that. The Hohenstaufen knew it was the right thing. It was objectively, from a political and strategical point of view, the most sensible thing to do. Every ruler who came at the top, regardless of their political background, did that and acted in the same way. In many ways, I think the Crusades were similar. It's true that the commitment should have come there also from royalty, and that not always kings could, or emperors even, could participate to the Crusades. That some Crusade efforts were also thwarted by in fact, the investiture controversy, by excommunication. Some leaders, the First Crusade was won by the barons. There was no king there, and so the church too had a role in the way also the Crusader states took shape, and probably also not much of a negative one for indirect reasons, including the fact that the Kingdom of Jerusalem managed essentially to keep papal control out, which was a big deal. It was something that secular rulers in Europe couldn't really do at that point, one way or another. But outre-mer, it was feasible. The same goes for, think about the wars between France and England. I mean, they were always, or at least there was always the potential threat of a war to break out, and they had to be there in a way. And so sometimes they couldn't really participate. Then the Crusades were not fought just in the Near East. They were fought in the Baltic, were fought in the Iberian Peninsula, importantly enough. And so, of course, they belong to a broader struggle that was interpreted very often decline, in this sense, on the base of also the local interests, really. So the Near East actually had an enormous potential, and the Crusader states themselves, as they had been created, and as the military history could have gone easily otherwise, could have achieved really a lot, right? They could have maintained actual control on the land. And what we see was not meant to be doomed since the beginning, and probably a greater horizon, or the one that Europeans were already gaining at the time, from the sign of, of the same lower echelons of the same military hierarchy, etc., would have probably worked better. And that's the same reason why the church, and part also the secular rulers, understood the importance of the development of the military chivalric monastic orders, right? Because those were being created with the purpose properly of making this men dedicate exclusively to the the crusading effort. Even when they actually began to become important enough and to participate to the disputes existing, in fact, between the papacy and the empire. At some point, this should have been backed by the church initially, but they came to be protected mostly by the imperial authority, in part, and eventually were taken out by the same secular authority with the papal support as well. Think about the Templars, but for reasons that, in fact, were more internal to Europe. This is what we tend. They were also motivated in part. I'm not saying that the conquest of the Near East had to happen just for the sake of it, but let's say that it was definitely a way to recompose that Christian ecumenic unity that the universal value that the same military class had always had since the time of the Imperium, the old traditional religion, had meant, and that also for Christianity meant a lot. But it's obvious that if the same Christendom is clashing among each other because it has to quarrel about the prerogatives of secular and spiritual power, which are actually very important things. So I'm not again saying it was a problem. As I always say, I think that investiture controversy provided the West with a moral capacity that we hardly account enough, even just in its own existence, but for let alone the scale of it. That we cannot think that the participation in the Near Eastern territories was so felt, and that objectively this could have simply gone on by some sort of individual autonomous push dictated by conscience or other beliefs, right? Say in general, power was a precarious one for everybody at the time. So again, even the fact that the Crusaders scored a success in 1099 of that magnitude, and then they managed to keep those lands for another 100 years, and for another 100 years managed to at least remain in the land with some presence and possibility actually of reviving the thing, even knocking out Egypt. That was the main problem, telling the truth, for the control of the Near East. Before even the Seljuks that were fragmenting, or other powers like the Khwarezmians that just profited, like devouring the spoils of something that had already collapsed. Could have worked. It was extraordinary, and so on. So the integration would occur if there had been more commitment just to remain there, not just to make that fight in the Holy Land to say, okay, I have earned my place in paradise. Also because the same tradition, and this is a proof of same secularization and modernization of that world that had already occurred, right? The Middle Ages were not the peak of tradition at all. The Antiquity was the peak of tradition. And the same fact, again, that there was no real commitment, generally speaking, was in part due to lack of unity, the fragmentation, Western Europe, politically wise, etc., but also properly the misunderstanding in part of the truer traditional value of holy war and what this entails, and how it is to be achieved in combat, because there is no other way. In this sense, the monastic military orders fulfilled their duty, because they were literally created, conceived, and they performed as essentially to win or die, right, on the field, like either winning or being killed in the process. Naturally, they were just humans, and they would also in part surrender, etc. But the idea of being a picked elite uh, essentially, yeah, it was a community for serving as a sort of core, but very making properly the backbone, the elite of the fact of the Frankish knighthood in the West that wasn't quite numerous at all, really reveals in the massacres, in the sometimes even in the fanatic courage and boldness and aggressiveness of disorders, what that lifestyle had properly to be. I mean, the idea that you couldn't save yourself, you couldn't transfigure if you didn't die in combat. So I can imagine also the frustration from the side of those who truly believed in the older ideal and that knew that still at that time, because we know that that knowledge, even in an occult way, was being passed down, right? Especially among the military elite. Indeed, the extermination of the Templars deprived us probably of some important material for understanding this out, because we know in the modern age that those doctrines were still living. Even properly in the church, they were hidden, but they were just emerging here and there. Think about Meister Eckhart, but we have many other, even modern Lutheran. They kept this idea of what properly holy war was to be, and what achievable through it in a positive sense, in the idea of elevating yourself to heaven, literally. And even less today, these things could be properly understood, right? Not even in those environments that have made of holy war some kind of, fundamentalistic, in fact, objective. But let's say that without tradition, without knowledge of these things, and without properly a certain background and predisposition, you cannot achieve any of this, even when you accomplish that materially. But spiritually, it's a completely different thing. The Muslims too had similar things back in the day, by the way. Think about the Sufis. I made a video about how this helped also the Almohads and the Almoravids to revive their power in northern Africa and in Spain, etc. Because they had to maintain in part that those rituals were also very similar, the predisposition to war and to the monastic military orders in the West. And integration happened, of course, in everyday life, because the Crusaders that had arrived had been engulfed in the Crusader states' lands, were to administer the local communities. They lived among them, and obliged them to move themselves by keeping account the specific situation of this area. It was, in part it was colonized. We're speaking of colonialism is too much, but these lands were initially at least occupied militarily, and they had to be exploited with some kind of regime. But again, we're talking about the Middle Ages with capacities of community control that had essentially to just substitute the elite with another in order to work. And the word naturally marriages with Syrian, Armenian, and Christianized Saracen women. It happened all the time. There were alliances with infidel princes. As always, I mean, many instances the Crusaders fought against each other, having Muslim allies. Again, if you look at that in a dichotomic way, Christians versus Muslims, in a political sense, you have no idea what the Crusades really were in practice. For not talking about the inter-religious struggles. I mean, think about the Byzantines or the Cilician Armenians or other, even the same divisions within Islam. At that point, it was historically a much more fragmented one than, in fact, Christendom, a religion and Christendom, Christian one. And of course, we have seen it with the Turkomans, the employ of Turkic mercenaries from the side of the same military religious orders. it was obvious. And sometimes we see also probably an adaptation to the military customs. We talked about this in some videos. It's a bit speculative in a way, because in these centuries there was also development of Western knighthood that passed to something. The First Crusade was still kind of a, you know, not necessarily even a horseman, right? Somebody that surely knew how to fight superbly on horseback, but that also would dismount very often, or had more of an individualistic ethos, like more like hero fashion and a warrioristic attitude than anything, to pass to the end, the fall of Acre. We have already passed the peak of the dramatically and ultra intensively professional military, heavily armored mounted elite, perfectly able of carrying out thickly compact cavalry charges, repeating them over and over and over again, maintaining formation. That is something that requires a colossal collective training and an extraordinary capacity. There's also a much more expansive panoply in technical capacities, zootechnical skills. There was a very important cooperation throughout all this between European, let's say the European lands and the Outremer ones. I mean, think about the Cistercians that specialized in their land exploitation bias, also an important warhorse breeding, that were sent specifically from this fat, rich northern French soils, especially to raise robust horses, be sent properly in the Holy Land, were specifically destined to the religious military orders. Sometimes we say that there is this bias also that we attribute for defeatistic reasons in favor of the Muslim chivalric, say Muslim equestrian capacities from a tactical point of view, saying, the Christians lost because this damned horse archers coming back and forth, couldn't be reached. They had this tactic that the Westerners couldn't sort out. Well, actually, the entire military history of the Crusades says the exact opposite, right? You have heavily armored horsemen that would actually chase even light cavalry, and they would, put it in flight, because literally, it's not that those normally escape for no reason. They have to maintain position. If you charge them and they flee, it's because they're actually fleeing, even if they kind of not do it because of panic, but because they know that they can't close in, because otherwise it would be cut to pieces. The same, we see it even in Spain, right? The horses of the Reconquista, also the riding halajineta, as they call them, was, in that case, well, there had been a much longer coexistence between Christians and Muslims in the Iberian Peninsula, and they were basically just Iberian people. Let's be honest. It's not even makes sense to draw between Christians and Muslims there. But of course, yeah, if you're talking about Belgians, French, that went to fight in Syria for the first time, you can spot some, at least debatably, some sort of difference between the equestrian military cultures, even though they were quite similar, because frankly, the same heavily Persified and therefore feudalized Seljuk Turks had a radically chivalric mindset that they in fact estimate that there was a reciprocal estimate because of between them and the Crusaders, let alone also ferocious hatred that always exists in these cases. But again, there is no proof that the equestrian male culture was kind of inferior to this other ones, also Central Asian influenced ones. There's no proof at all. Just the Mongols came to prove that from their own side, but in the Near East there's no sanction of this. I studied those battles extensively, and I must say that I never found even a minimal proof of the fact that the Crusaders had wars because, I don't know, there was some progressed lack of equestrian development that their opponents could boast in the sense. And it's just, in military historical terms, not even an actual question that you can pose in these terms. Like, actually, it doesn't mean anything because it's not even about the horses of the knowledge of it. It's just how you eventually employ your military means, and this goes far beyond even just things like, I don't know, how fast you run, things like that. That has to do with collective training the most, and how you combine them, and morale and leadership and tactics in general. So it's another thing. And so there was an obvious osmosis materially. We would have been surprised of how similar a Crusader army and an Egyptian or a Turkic army actually looked like. Not just because of the presence of mercenaries from both sides in their respective armies, but for the same fact that, of course, by the 11th, 12th century, I mean, what do you think that material culture differed like? They were basically the same thing, and also they fought in the same place, and war is the greatest hybridizer of cultures that you can imagine, as well as its potential destroyer. And probably the same climate and terrain required some sort of adaptation for both combatants, right? The area is very different in, say, the region extended, like considering all the peoples that substantially intervened militarily, at least in the Holy Land. Well, this stretches from areas that are, I don't know, icy cold in the mountains to, literally the Arabian desert, right? So it was very diversified, but again, still pretty blended. Probably the Westerners had a slightly lighter equipment because of the heat, and like in the Near East, in the campaigning season, it's not really easy to go out there under the sun with full gear, etc. This happened all the time in medieval warfare. I mean, even in Central Europe, you see, he says certain summers people would take off their armor, literally in the face of the enemy. This is very well documented, and because literally, right? But you're not a robot. You are a human being. Even if you hope to survive, let's say, sometimes even less protection is better, because maybe provides you with better speed, etc. In any case, the Turcopoles, as we've seen, fought with the same identical tactics of the Turks, because they were Turks themselves sometimes, but the Turcopole actually becomes a tactical specialty. There were, I don't know, after the collapse of the Byzantine Empire, after the Fourth Crusade, were, I don't know, Greeks that went the Holy Land to fight as Turcopoles, because it was remunerative. People literally learned how to fight again in some new fashions, and there were surely many Northern Europeans among the Turcopoles themselves. So we cannot draw boundaries so radically when talking about properly what this military phase of the Crusade looked like. But speaking of the religious military orders, so the orders of the Temple, of the Hospital, and of the Holy Sepulchre, these were born within the context of the Crusade. Originally to cure the sick, to protect the pilgrims, to defend the holy places, and these were born quite spontaneously, as you know. There were some organizations like these that were essentially contractors' business that existed since from a very long time. I mean, going to the Holy Land was a normal thing for centuries. It's also a myth that the Seljuk occupation of Jerusalem actually brought to, first of all, to the Crusades per se, because frankly, and even the threat posed by the Turks at the time of the First Crusade, actually the Seljuks were already fragmented on their own, and they had, they had left the pilgrimage open. Actually, the Turkic occupation improved the security means of these companies for escorting the pilgrims to the Holy Land that remain open. But we're talking about, I mean, since ever, right? As long as the holy places were recognized, as the Roman Empire had Christianized etc., the pilgrimage had happened throughout all the Islamic era as well. So that's yet another issue. But um, the real meaning of the roots, at least, of the monastic military orders have to be reconnected to the wider project of control of the chivalric class from the side of the by the church, essentially. This aspect was necessary at a time in which the church, in fact, was reforming, transforming into a monarchy, and the First Crusade was the most glamorous success of the church from a military point of view, because it's as if at this point the church had had its own divisions. The First Crusade, as we've seen, had escaped the emperor, the king's control. These men had the Crusade of the Poor, as you know, they were literally exterminated because, I mean, let's be honest, they didn't know even what they were doing. But I mean, of course, the barons, and so those who knew what war is, mounted up one of the single most, perfect accomplishments of logistical skill ever seen in military history. Right? You would ask yourself what a Belgian knight like Godfrey of Bouillon didn't even know about Syria or Palestine in the 11th century. Well, these men were able to mount up one of the single most successful expeditions that collected all these barons, these knights from Europe, and managed to pass enemy territories for a very long time, managing to overcome all the difficulties in dramatic moments, by the way, in which the situation was essentially to collapse, was critical, and to conquer one of the major cities of the world at the time, occupied by hostile forces, thousands of kilometers away from their bases, that was enormous, right? And this had been accomplished by the church. The church had mounted up the whole thing, had paid for the crusade, had maintained essentially the direction of the fort, and supported, of course, all the moral side that had brought this men just to be supported by their communities. They were properly believing that this was the big day, that this would have essentially renewed the world. It would have brought the order, it would have saved heaven, because this was the entire thing. It was the clash against the forces of evil and of darkness that wanted to overthrow the world. Jerusalem was seen as the old Asgard that was threatened in the dimming of the twilight of the gods in human consciousness, and that, these holy warriors that were holy because the imperium was in fact the universal value of religious military nature, that they brought with them as knights, which especially from a secular point of view is also what the church was trying to kind of blur there, but that also in the rejection of the papal legates by the king of Jerusalem at the beginning of the occupation was actually enforced, was seen as the representation of the golden age and the fulfillment of the greater of the duties in the in human existence in the first place. So the moral force that Europe showed at this time was incredible. It wasn't surely born the day before. Again, the Crusades didn't start from a day to another. It was centuries that the West and the papacy were properly coordinating these successful military expeditions that were to be rewarded with a place in heaven in Spain, in the Mediterranean. Quite big successes, especially in the western Mediterranean islands, at the hands of the Italian maritime republics. It also supported the Reconquista that was starting to push down the Muslims in the Iberian Peninsula, quite effective way. Well, that's a bit an obscured reality of the Crusades, effectively before the Crusades, right? It's a bigger one. And more in general, what the military beliefs were at the time concerning properly salvation and holy war and etc., that were already there, weren't created with the Crusades, right? So we have brutally underestimated, in fact, the early Middle Ages. We have deemed them to be the Dark Ages, this moment in which, in the West wasn't really happening anything, it was just a bunch of primitive brutes, and this is actually not what was happening. It was a massive civilization that by the 12th century had already surpassed basically the Byzantine and the Islamic one, and that was basically to take over the entire Europe and the Mediterranean as well, as it had started already from the 11th century, or even I mean before the end of it with the Crusade, the First Crusade, if not even before. So the theorization of the hybrid figure of the monk knight, that is the man of peace and of solitude, that is at the same time man of war and the mundane and warlike action, was formulated famously enough, we made a video on this too, by Bernard of Clairvaux in the famous treatise De Laude Nove Militiae, that is to say, the Militia Christi, that originally in St. Paul was exclusively spiritual. As you know, it was proper of the monk. It was referred at this point to the Crusade Knight, right? And it wasn't coming out of the blue. Even in here, Bernard of Clairvaux didn't really create anything. I made a video entitled, in fact, the Indo-European Holy War from Arjuna to the Templars, that actually explains this. And that is, again, just something that existed since millennia, and that now the Christians were fully integrating into their own system, especially in Western Europe, because along the Byzantines there was an actual idiosyncrasy towards the crusade, the concept of crusade itself, and it's a very complex topic. We'll have to make a video about that as well. But guess which side actually took over? Literally Constantinople eventually in 1204. So this was in many ways the coming back of the of the Western Imperium, and that was clamorously won, in fact, at this time. The Crusades, taken like just the Near Eastern ones, do not render justice to the overflowing resources that probably Western Europe at that point spread everywhere, taking over. I mean, the Baltic Crusades were a success for good. The Reconquista was a success for good. What happened in the Near East also came in a moment of broader contraction of all powers at the time, including the Mongol one, the other Muslim ones, and the same Europeans ones, because of the recession of the late 13th century and before the big crack of the 14th. So eventually you can argue in the modern age there was a new comeback that was from the West. The Ottomans, actually in late Middle Ages, as you know, in the early modern age, showed their massive attributes in terms of political and military capacity, and great part of that was actually due to the fact that they were, let's be honest, they were kind of more of a Western power than an Eastern one. They were born fundamentally into the Bosphorus, so like Western lands since ever, and and that's, I'm sorry we stopped to talk about military history, because we also made a lot of stuff about the Ottomans. We'll talk about that, and I hope first of all to re-upload some of them, so maybe also the ones who have no idea of how much stuff I made yet back in the day can rewatch them. But not just that there is an Ottoman warfare playlist and all this stuff, but it's important to see these waves of coming backs, because they're kind of contingential in a way, but still they're so big that you can't really say, this is just a single power did something limited, circumscripted. No, these were big things that speak the moral voice of a civilization. And um, let's say Bernard of Clairvaux extraordinary synthesis of the monk knight, let's say, is present in Wu, in poverty and chastity, living a communitary life, fights the holy war professionally, and therefore Wu is a crusade for life. You say, poverty and chastity, these are the Christians that are so subverting the values of the traditional world. They're not subverting anything. It was the same ideal of the pagan tradition that simply lived on in Christianity. Christianity didn't copy it either. It was just there, always, all the time, in the Christian society as well. Poverty and chastity, the idea that this was a virile endeavor, that women were seen as, say, ideologically as the tectonic element, that even the church, in a sense, had embodied, for which, in fact, Godfrey Bouillon had stopped the papal legates by maintaining full control on the kingdom of Jerusalem. And so this, think about the Lohengrin, or all these chivalric, in fact, epos that is coming back exactly in these years from the Germanic past, from the Celtic past, that was all about the older migration era beliefs that had been a purely virile rule over the feminine disorder and chaos, right, of the cultures of the Great Mother of the Mediterranean, of the fertility, the Pelagian cult that was subdued by the radically patriarchal Indo-Europeans loaded with the Apollonian celestial military virtue, right? And so this was the concept behind that. This is to say, I don't know, we don't know about much really about the sexual life of the nice monks, because you can imagine that, first of all, this man, there is a very interesting aspect of these communities. That, first of all, of course, they are also variegated, but there is a pattern there too, that most of these men came to these orders after they had lost something. These were men of the world. They had of course, even a family. Maybe their wife had died, and their children too, because of this terrible illnesses of the times. These people had nothing to live for. They said, I devote myself to a greater order, to a greater duty, right? Or I don't know, everybody had their path to follow, etc. But these were not going there to pick flowers. These were going there to cut people alive in parts. So this is not, say, certain other beliefs or attitudes that you can have basically are nullified, are completely annihilated. These communities were rough, right? Just to be trained as a knight in the secular world, you had to get broken bones, to be abused, to be literally destroyed mentally and rebuilt as another human being. You were not master of yourself anymore. You were completely devoted to the cause. And because if you didn't receive that degree of trauma that would thicken you up like a non-human at that point, you cannot cut people to pieces. You simply can't. Like, human mind by default is not designed for. Like, these were ultra specialized exclusively to that single and uniquely possible purpose. So it was much greater than, I don't know, Bernard of Clairvaux and the kind of mildly effeminated character of the priestly class. Like, this was about, I mean, really people were seeing some of the... In fact, this struck me always because it's full of knights in medieval times at the end of their lives repented for what they had done. Because you have to imagine, even psychologically speaking, that you living in this world was a constant burden. Like, people were tortured existentially all the freaking time. These people saw death everywhere, in any circumstance. They didn't have security about anything. So this way was seen as the force that would give you the capacity of going beyond and literally achieving heaven, which is not like, just the afterlife. It's something that in theory can happen in life itself. It was seen like that traditionally. And it's another point that I was thinking about. But anyway, you understand more or less the tone of what I'm saying. And it's obvious that, again, the world had already aged. So as we were saying before, maybe an 11th century crusader whose ancestors maybe weren't even Christian. Maybe their grandfathers weren't. I mean, just think about a Norman crusade. They, or at least that they remembered what it was like before we had all those views of the world, of the palace of the gods threatened by the forces of the darkness, this idea of the Great North, that from which eventually this stocks come to rule the South, etc., was so fresh, vivid, and living in their memory. They lived by that, and Christianity again simply spoke the same language. It had always done it. I made tons of videos on this topic on how this gradual path from furor to discipline, and the necessity from here to chivalry, the necessity to give at least even a greater force, a greater coordination, a better purpose, a more unitary direction to this activity. It's what the church catalyzed, right? And this is especially what happened at the First Crusade, when again the secular authorities remained astonished by how the Roman Church had managed to gather these forces from their own same subjects and to bring them, to organize them, to literally mount up this thing that nobody had ever seen before, because this thing had never happened. This was basically the reactivation of the great Indo-European migrations in a style that again was over since the times of ever, right, of the great migrations, but even before, because this came from everywhere. This wasn't just, I don't know, people moving because there was another knocking at the door. This was literally somebody taking up arms because they had that purpose that, again, remembers Romulus Caelus and the rape of the Sabines, this seasonal, invasions that the older Indo-European peoples launched because of lack of resources or impossibility of expansion in their own communities, were sent out to take new land, to start a new order, and to gain glory and victory, properly in a heavenly sense, somewhere else where this order was threatened, by the way, where somebody was weaker to be subdued, and when there was a reward awaiting for them. This is the same exact idea living on in these times and places. So we cannot read the Crusades if we do not understand how alive these beliefs had always remained since ever. And nobody really, if you go to any school or any university, normally nobody will tell you this. You study, I can show you all the manuals that have been that I had under my site. None of these topics are touched. I simply describe you what happened, but the reasons, the meanings, the symbols, none of that. And that's why all that kind of mysticism and mystery behind, the secret of the Templars. This is really kind of the secret of the Templars. We can't talk more extensively about that if you want to, but let's say it's not conspiracy. It's just we know it. It's written on the history books of 80 years ago. Everybody studied that thing at the time. It wasn't really anything to conceal about this stuff, because it's readily evident to anybody who studies ancient history, its meanings. It's not an occultistic thing. It's not a mysteric thing. It's just what should be banal ABC of cultural tradition of Western Europe and beyond, by the way. This idea of living a crusader, being a soldier, the Militia Christi, being a soldier of Christ. Think about the ancient Latin motto, vivere militare est, and all these things. So the of course the obvious realization that life is a constant struggle, and that there can't be any human dignity if you don't conceive your life as a constant battle. First of all, against yourself, because this was also not the trick, but the entire, again, pillar of pagan and Christian religion at the time. The external is an illusion. Transfiguration, winning heaven, simply means that you are able in your own soul to destroy the negative side of it, the dark side of it, the one that you need, the chaotic, feminine one that you need to tame and to crush and to actually elevate itself into divine glory, possessing the female demon of victory. Hence also the idea of the field side, the Valkyries, the virgins in heaven. It's the thing that existed since millennium in belief. It's the idea of transfiguring your own soul in the winged victory that will bring you to heaven. And this happens only internally. What happens around you on the battlefield is just the moment in which that thing emerges within you. Because you're not scared because fear is emanated by something external of you. It's because fear is it's you who emanates fear. So if you crack that, if you take that out, there will be this kind of circuit break for which this soul will be liberated by your body in pure spirit and will take you to heaven, which happens in the moment of the greatest sacrifice, in the moment in which you're killed in holy combat. This is the true meaning of it. And you cannot achieve that if you're not trained, if you are not trained spiritually, physically, and you can undertake this, the greatest of all endeavors, that is defeating evil within yourself, right? That you cannot absolutely claim. And that's also the same idea of the original sin in Christianity that tells that this couldn't be achieved by through the church, etc. But the meaning is really the same. Because who are you, even if you think that you could save yourself, that is possible to claim that you're perfect for salvation. Nobody can, right? You're an idiot if you think like that. But this doesn't mean that you shouldn't try. And that's the purpose of life. So the papacy was perfectly aware of this. This is yet another aspect of the story that, aside from the ecclesiastical phase that was probably living within the same milieu, that is the knowledge properly of this military religion, and that the same Christianity had assimilated since the time, in fact, of St. Paul, but even before, actually. I mean, the Christian language is extremely violent, as you know, since Jesus, and it's thankfully meant to be like that. And the link, however, between the papacy and the new orders in the Holy Land remained in the early time, especially. And this is particularly important because, aside from what we said before, that is to say that especially the Kingdom of Jerusalem maintained the adequate distance from the papal monarchy in terms of hierarchical connections, etc. But it recognized, of course, the great spiritual role that the papacy had in having led this all, and it was the only and uniquely possible authority from Rome and its divine meaning that was, in this regard, even equated in a sense to the one of the Holy Land. I mean, Europeans were much more smug about Rome than Jerusalem. Even when they actually visited both, everybody was talking about Rome. It was talking about Jerusalem, all the marvels that also, are present there, as you know. But of course, the primacy of the papacy was not discussed. On the contrary, probably the same monastic military orders contributed to define better the papal monarchy, because they showed how they were at least deferent in towards the utmost spiritual authority. This is, after all, what Bernard of Clairvaux had really meant to do, because the Laude Nove Militia is aimed essentially at scorporating the knight monk from any kind of secular allegiance, just like in the Gospels, right? As we were saying before, it's the same carelessness for everything that is outside of you, anything secular, including the powers that is found in the Bible as well, that can make you, can save you, can make you fully Christian, right? Which is also the struggle itself. So it's a very difficult thing and complicated, I would say, just to attain. Also because, again, you can't save yourself, but it was properly meant to do this, to restore essentially pure spirit as a force in the world. And so the secular authorities that also, as you know, differently from Islam, were very much respected in the Christian tradition, were, however, seen as, yes, remember that, yes, for now there are, but remember that this world doesn't belong to you. And that, yeah, we're secular authorities, they're given power by God, but they can't even control what now you see the church has been able to achieve all by itself by reconquering Jerusalem. Which power in Western Europe would have ever recovered Jerusalem? I mean, the Byzantines tried at some point because they were close and they would wanted to recover, of course, their own territories belonged to the empire before. Ecumenically, it was part of the same order of ideas, but like without the Crusades, I don't know, it's not that France or England would have one day said, okay, let's go conquer Jerusalem just for... No. This was the force of it all, right? And the monastic military orders embodied this, in fact, extraneation from the world, paradoxically, by being in the heat of it, in the most brutal and violent realities that you can even hopefully not dream of, because, you know, even just dreaming of that would make you scarred for life. The proliferation of the religious military orders is also meaningful, because these spread everywhere, as you know. And they would become rapidly powerful everywhere the enemy of Christ was fought. So much that already, for example, in the 30s of the 12th century, in the Iberian Peninsula, such orders were instituted by Alfonso I, the warlike, quite of a nickname there, and that were heirs of, in fact, of the reigns of Aragon and Navarre, that at that time were also, in fact, involved in the Reconquista, in this dramatic effort to recover the Iberian Peninsula from the Muslims. And I made videos about the monastic military orders, not many, but I hope we will keep expanding on them, because the spread of these orders showed how the need was felt to have them. Not by, necessarily the top authorities, but by the people. Because again, the Pope could have said, okay, let's go to the Crusade. And then nobody answered. There is just like one of those, I don't know how you call them, cactus balls, I don't know, that bounce, and it's a desert. No, these people flowed. They swarmed. They from everywhere, right, to join the crusade, the appeal. So these were all moral forces that just needed a command for being unleashed. And this the enormity of the monastic military orders is measured just by their own wealth at home, right? Not much what they could capitalize in the Near East, which indeed, one of the most beautiful chapters in here would be to say the riches that the Crusaders found there, and how much was there at the time of the Crusaders that was lost eventually. because I mean, there between the Jews, the Romans, the Byzantines, the Arabs, there had been the Turks. There had been so much that had been brought there and preserved there, right? Even just in terms of other relics, etc. We were talking about the Vandal sack of Rome some months ago, thinking about the candelabra that the Romans had taken away from the Temple of Jerusalem after they had destroyed it, and eventually were taken by the Vandals to Africa after the 455 sack, and then Belisarius conquered Africa, brought the relics to Constantinople, and Justinian allegedly brought them to Jerusalem again. Like, we have that, some of which belong to properly to the treasury of the Roman emperors, right? So all the stuff that went there, and you can't even imagine how much was lost. I mean, if you think about that, you I don't know, you want to kill yourself. But it's like the monastic military orders put their hands on this stuff. In part, they brought them to Europe, but in the same Europe, they had an enormous amount of prestige and lands. Right? That's the reason why, I don't know, the Templars were fundamentally knocked out. Surely there was something else behind that ideologically. But the sheer amount of possessions everywhere in Western Europe was immense. And this shows that these communities that were born basically in an autonomous way from people that simply decide, okay, I want to choose the monastic life, but still to fight, or vice versa, whatever the original intent really was, happened by itself. It was needed for the spirituality of the time. It was an enormous, especially warlike potential that was beautifully disciplined and controlled within such institutions that managed to channel it to a big deal of success, because again, the Near East was lost, and the biggest thing was lost was the Kingdom of Jerusalem in many ways. But the Baltic Crusades were a success. The Reconquista was a success. The Mediterranean became a Christian lake. So it's very difficult not to see how much this wave overwhelmed an enormous part of the world at the time. It was known in Europe, etc., and how it's been kind of overlooked in its entirety. You tell the history of the Crusades, again, people just get emotionalistic about it. They make it a terrible problem and similar things, but actually look at what it's been in its meaning, not in its, and also in its accomplishments, by the way. Apparently, these perspectives are not thoroughly appreciated, but they should be recovered, because, in my opinion, it makes no sense to study this history without knowing such things. And anyhow, for today, I stop it here. I just hope that you enjoyed this video. If you did, please share it. Otherwise, leave a like or subscribe to my channel if you're interested in my upcoming content. And for now, I thank you heartily for listening to me. I wish you a nice time and see you next time. Bye.